Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. Beautiful. All right. Good morning, everyone. First off, I'm super excited to be here. I'm super humbled. So I'm here to talk to you about my story a bit, about how I fell in love with React and what that like ultimately means for you. So anyway, a little bit about me. As David Pellerin said, I'm a web dev. I'm pretty new to the game, so I've been working professionally as a web developer for about a year and a half. I work at an amazing agency called TWG with David Pellerin. And I've also, like having worked at an amazing agency, had the opportunity to work on some amazing projects with some amazing clients. However, being kind of fresh to like JavaScript development, I've like personally experienced the pain of building very large and difficult to reason about applications. Really, I had like no one to blame but myself. I was like learning it, like in this process. I knew I was doing the wrong things because the things I was doing were like essentially punchlines to jokes. I was doing things like creating 600-line controllers, like all the things that are like not good. So I knew I must be doing something wrong. But quite frankly, I also found like the environment's a bit difficult to reason about. So like as I was going through these projects, I was like keeping a list of all the terrible mistakes I was making, but also kind of what I wanted my next environment, framework, whatever, to do for me. So in comes this beautiful stranger, React. I'm kind of like stuck knee deep up Angular Creek, and I'm just like waiting for my next opportunity to jump on a React project. Mainly because I'd heard about all the how beautiful life could be, how easy it could be, how easy to reason about everything could become. So when I did finally have an opportunity to work on a React project, I fell head over heels immediately. Everything was so clear, everything was so readable, and like quite frankly, professionally, I wasn't embarrassed at the stuff that I was creating. I wasn't embarrassed of my spaghetti code output. So I actually was so proud of the stuff I was working on. This is a real folder in my Finder. I actually started like keeping a log of all the stuff that I had like powered through, been really proud that I built, and yeah, I keep it as a reminder to like how far I've gotten essentially. But we're not here to like talk about we're not here to really talk about me. We're here to talk about you and how you can get your first React project up and started. I just want to pass on some of the learnings and the love that I had. And ideally, what you come away with today is like a good idea of what React is to begin with. But then also, if you are looking to start building within React, and this is like your first project, whether by yourself or on a team, hopefully you walk away with a really good idea of the workflow as well. So the last thing is, I also hope, if you don't have one yet, I hope you get a folder like this on your desktop, because quite frankly, I didn't think like a change in framework could be this life-changing, but it was. So anyway, let's move on to the project itself. So if we're talking about how you would start your first React project, we would need to like outline the project process. The good thing is like not that much new learnings here. It's like the same how you would plan and like how you would go through the process of any other project. We're just gonna like adapt it to how React wants us to be our best developer selves. So first things first, with most projects, we'll probably begin with planning. So we'll talk about how we can kind of mold our planning towards a React environment. We'll talk about collaborating with design. It's like always a very important step, especially if you work at in an environment where you are developing while design is still happening, so we can create a really great collaborative process there. We'll talk about project setup, the dreaded project setup. We'll talk about builds, and we'll talk about how we can like begin building our project, and then finally even testing, which is a big win for me within React. So first things first, planning. So before we even begin, we need to diligently plan, mainly because out of planning, we're gonna learn, I guess like the discipline that comes with building a React project. So let's move into it and you'll see what I mean. First things first, get whatever planning process you like set up. We use Kanban, and I'm a pretty big fan of it. So we're gonna be building like a to-do column, and then as we progress things, they'll go into like a current doing state and then done. No news there, which is good. We're not like, we don't wanna learn like everything at once. We're here to like learn React mainly and focus our energy on that. So anyway, you might begin your project with a bunch of screens that look like this, and it's always quite intimidating to receive a full flow and be like, how am I gonna turn this? Like, how am I gonna take all of these pieces and start with an app, or like start building an app essentially? So the way that I would normally have planned before, and maybe most of us still do, is I would start breaking it down into pieces essentially, but I would start kind of outward in. So I would start with, okay, say first I have to build this like next event section. So in my like Kanban board, I'll throw that in there. Cool, we got the section. And then probably within that section, I'm like, cool, I have like these 3 cards. So I'm gonna plan to build, in this case, a curriculum card. And then to make my life even easier, I would also probably like break down all the elements that are like part of it. And so in here, I'm like outlining, cool, I'm gonna need this like card element that I'm creating. I got this like little progress bit. I got a heading, I got this like facilitator, and then finally I have a button. And I would do this over and over for those 3 cards essentially. So we have same, card, heading, date, and button. And then our 3rd card in that section is our next event card. So we'll do the same, where we're like just outlining all these pieces. Cool, right? Nothing new. And this is kind of what I would walk away with, being like, okay, so like let's say if in this week or sprint or whatever, my goal is to build that next event section, I now have all the like pieces that I know I have to like go towards it. However, there's like a lot of repetition that I'm seeing here, and what I would usually solve with like CSS, I can now actually solve with React as well. So this is kind of where I'm highlighting that we have like a card element, we got this like heading element, but it's like there's instances that exist across all these cards. First things first, the first like part of React that I fell in love with was the idea of components. So components are super, super great in that they let you really like isolate what it is that you're trying to solve with this like one thing you're focused on, and it lets you create like reusable pieces of UI. So if we have all that repetition, instead of like repeating, you know, the markup that we'd have to create to like make that card and everything, we can just plan to create that card component instead of that card element, that heading component. And I've gone through and I've like created components for all those pieces where I had repetition. And instead of starting with like, I guess the way that I would have thought of it before is I would have started like out in. So I flipped the process where instead of creating a next event section and then going down, I'm actually creating all the pieces first so that I can begin assembling these views. So I would start with creating that like core library of a button, a heading, facilitator, all those pieces, and then I would assemble that card, and then I would assemble finally like that next event section. Right on. And so the first, I guess, 5 there, so those first components, we've justified creating a component because we're saying, okay, there's repetition here, but there's only one instance of that curriculum card, there's only one instance of that bootcamp card, what have you. The reason we're creating those as components is because components also allow us to, like, again, we're thinking in isolation, so we can also create components when we want to specialize a view. So like when there's a view that like we need to like function in a very, very specific way, we can kind of create these specialized components where it's like we know this card, which is like an offshoot of like the card component, is going to function specifically how we want it to. And look, exactly how we want it to. And so now in my planning, instead of planning to build all these elements, I just have all these pieces I'm going to need to like assemble my cards, and then finally, even the pieces that I'll need to assemble my next event section. And this was like a really, really big aha moment for me when I started my first React project, because in this case, say with this view, in just outlining those 5 core components that we said we were going to build to like start that library of components, this is how much of our view we've already knocked off. So like it's far less intimidating to start a build, and I don't know, for me, I was like, this is great, I can't wait. So this is where maybe our first love with React will begin. Not only are we working with a framework that encourages us to focus on being reusable and modular, it like makes it easier for us. So I don't know, how's that not a win? Okay, so the wins that we're gonna have with planning with our first React project are, if we start thinking with those smallest pieces, so like the button, the heading, and we create those first, then we'll have everything we'll need to assemble bigger and bigger views and eventually pages in different flows. And so our primary goal when we start planning especially is to build that library of core components so that we can use them to our advantage later. All right, I'm gonna take a drink. Okay, next up, it's important, it's extremely important. So the next step in our process is probably design collaboration. So we just learned this like really great concept about React components and like how it wants us to think super reusably in a super modular way. And so the first thing I'd say in creating a collaborative process between development and design is to kind of pass on that knowledge that you just got as a developer. So if you can have that conversation with your designer about how we're going to build, perhaps they can form their process of design to think in that way as well, so that when we go to build it, we're like, oh, cool, we've already said, like, these are all the pieces that we're gonna be super, like, quick with, because we're just assembling now. Anyway, and the other thing is also to get a kind of a mutual understanding for what a style guide is. So I've often received style guides like this from my designer, and these are great because I get to, like, set up base styles. However, the style guide that I'm gonna be talking about is what I think is the responsibility of the developer. So we outlined all those core components that we are going to build, and so I think as we begin building them, our responsibility should be to maintain this library of components that we have, so that they can be used as reference for, like, across our team, so developers benefit from this, but also for designers as well, to see kind of like what we have already locked in and what we're missing and what we need to build. And that also, I think, creates, like, a really great place to kind of have this, like, working contract between designers and developers, where if the focus is efficiency and we're constantly trying to build, if we already have this library of components and they're committed to the style guide, then perhaps our focus should be to keep building more components as opposed to maybe tweaking existing ones. And while I think style guides are extremely important, perhaps on your first project, there's no need to, like, lose steam in building one. There's no need to, like, kind of get frustrated with the build process of it. My first style guide was just like a / style guide. It was just a page where I dumped components as I created them. So it was extremely easy because the way that we, like, break them out, they're just self-contained. I plop them in and they behave exactly like I want them to. And it's not glamorous at all. We had to, like, introduce some discipline around, like, okay, can we, like, label these sections? Can we be a little bit more clear about what it is that we're presenting here in terms of components? But it was a really, really great tool, and it took 0 effort to get off the ground. So what makes this process so easy, and what you'll really, really fall in love with when it comes to React, is the thinking of those standalone components. And so it's, while it's very little work for us to document them, that should encourage us to share them, essentially, because it really shouldn't take that long to get them into a style guide. Anyway, so design wins, or design collaboration wins that we can have with our first React project are creating a style guide is great because it's a great reference for everybody on the team. I know PMs have checked in just to see, like, hey, where we're at. I just want to see how we're doing. So it's not just exclusive to design and development. And then finally, don't lose time in making one. There's, like, no need to, if with the first couple of components, go maybe out of your way. Just make a page and plop them in there. Okay, cool. So we're getting so close. We planned. We, like, know exactly how we're going to work with our team members. Life is looking so great and beautiful with React. And then we have to hit the screeching halt that is setup. So we probably are going to need to bring a build tool in. And that's mainly because we need to, like, run this JavaScript app somehow on our machines as we're developing. So when I say a build tool, I mean, like, the most common one is Gulp. Like, I've used Gulp a lot. And apparently, you can use Gulp to run your React projects. That was a learning for me as I was researching for this presentation. Most likely, the tool you will see coupled with React projects is a tool called Webpack. Webpack is, like, a beautiful, beautiful solution to a lot of problems. However, it is extremely intimidating and difficult to reason about in the beginning. And so before we even begin our project, my advice to you is don't get frustrated with Webpack. You're here to fall in love with React. So don't bring in a build tool, actually. Don't worry about what tooling you'll be using. Don't worry about customizing it. Basically, don't spin your wheels until, before you can even generate anything in the page, mainly because there's great solutions available to you, like Create React App, which is actually made by Facebook, the same folks that make React. So it comes highly recommended, and the setup is super, super easy. We have to, assuming we have Node and NPM on our machines, we have to globally install Create React App, and then we can just create a new app, in this case my app, and hit NPM start. It's beautiful, and it will also, I think the other great thing that comes with Create React App is the fact that it also sets up a really great folder structure for you to begin with, so you already start with, like, the best discipline going forward. Your other option is to, like, look up a boilerplate, pick one if you want to, but all in all, don't lose time with trying to, like, engineer, I guess, maybe a build process if it's on you to be doing this, because you're here to learn React. Give yourself the space that you need to do that. And so it's so amazing. It's quite amazing, like, how easily you can get, like, off the ground with your first React project. But quite frankly, like the moment of like falling in love with React for myself was when I had to delve into the actual like Webpack files myself and start to like do my own config. So basically just appreciate where we're at in terms of like you can just grab like a build tool off the internet. You don't have to do the configuration yourself, but just know that there's like a lot of love that goes into making builds happen for us. So setup wins that we can have with our first React project. So give yourself the space you need. If you came here to learn React and this is your first time, do that. Give yourself the time. And then finally, once you feel comfortable with React, you can, using Create React App, you can just like eject from that flow. You can start to like do the research. And maybe you'll be better equipped with what it is that you're trying to solve with your build, having gone through, the flow a bit. So you can do so later. You don't have to feel bad. There's no shame in doing that. And then finally, my advice is use Create React App. Yeah. Okay, this is the exciting part. Now we're going to talk about building. So literally everything has led up to this very point, right here and right now. Let's kind of review the definition that we had established before for components. So again, we're talking about like these independent pieces of UI. They're reusable, and we get to like think about each piece in isolation. So like, let's not forget that definition going forward. And another thing that's important to note is that while components exist across, like the concept of components exists across many JavaScript frameworks, they're also part of future browser spec. So we should probably get comfortable and learn them now before they are imposed on us. So first things first, let's start by building our button component. So again, if we think of that definition of components, if we're thinking of things in isolation, the easiest way to isolate something is just to make a folder that will contain just the things that it's concerned with. So in this case, I'm making a button folder, and inside of it, I'm making a button.js, a button.css, super easy, super approachable. You may have been, I don't know, expecting to see like a button.html or some kind of markup file in here. Just know that our JavaScript file is going to hold both our markup and our JavaScript. So like it's going to be the functionality of JavaScript with the ability to write our markup, which is great. So first things first, the docs say the easiest way, like verbatim, the simplest way to define a component is to write a JavaScript function. So let's do just that. Here I'm creating a function. It's called button. All button does is it just returns the markup of a button with the label, I guess in this case, of click me. And so while we're looking at this, it's important to note the syntax that we're looking at. So here at the top, we're like, oh, that's a function definition. Like, isn't that JavaScript? We said this is a JavaScript file. And then we see like our markup bit. And that's like, as we said, our markup would live inside of our JavaScript. So like, that's kind of the HTML-y part. So like, how are we able to do this? This doesn't seem like it should work. But mainly you should know that when you are writing any markup within your React app, like in your JavaScript files, what you're actually writing in is a language called JSX. My definitions for it are that JSX is like JavaScript disguised as a markup language, where it's like supercharged HTML because it lives in the environment of JavaScript. But all in all, JSX provides this syntactic sugar, as it's called, for creating React components. And it's just important to know that while what we're writing in there is like, oh, okay, I have like my button, like HTML-ish tag, it all transpiles, so it like converts to JavaScript by the time it gets to your browser. So thanks again, build tools. But I guess the biggest win for me with JSX is that it keeps us from writing something that looks like this. So what we're doing here is we still have that function called button. It's no longer, as the docs say, the simplest way to create a component, because now we're relying on this create element method. We have to pass like what kind of HTML tag it looks or we're looking to generate. And then finally, we have to also pass like the value between our opening and closing tag, which is not at all what we want to see in markup. So this is like a much, I would say, more alienating approach to almost doing it. But now we want to use our button. So we've defined it, we've returned that markup, we've done it the JSX way, and now we probably want to use our markup in some, our component in some context. So here we are, we're just including button, capital B like we called it, and it's important to note like this syntax is, I guess for me, it's quite reminiscent of like self-closing elements. So in this case, like when we have image tags, all the information the image tag needs to know lives within that first opening tag within attributes, and the same for the button with at least like how we're using it in this context. Any information it needs to know is going to live where attributes live. Cool. We just made a React component. It's our first one. It doesn't do anything, though. So let's maybe figure out how to make it do a bit more than just nothing. So first things first, most likely, if we are creating a button, the most common variable will be whatever the value is within, whatever the value is of our label within the context we're using it. So because these are just, component definitions are just JavaScript functions, functions do a lot more than just return things. So maybe the first thing that we want to do is pass an argument. So whenever you're creating a React component, the argument that becomes available to you is a object called props. And so most components can be customized through these props. We can pass different things, like where I said there were attributes. Those are actually going to be props that we'll be defining and passing down. And then finally, like I'd said, props are also an object. So because they're objects, we just keep jamming more and more props, more and more ways to customize our component. All right, so let's go back to that context where we're using it. And let's say here we actually want our button to have a label of no click me, let's say in this case, right on. Like we said, we have to inform the function of what argument it is we're passing down. In this case, we'll call it props as it is. And then finally, let's extract that prop that we just called label, as we defined it there, from the props object. So I think that's pretty simple. It's quite inviting to write. And finally, we don't need the hard-coded value anymore, so let's cut that. That's what it looks like, right? We know what it looks like to delete some stuff. And then save it and see what it generates, which in this case is an empty button. So it's always 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But now we are trying to figure out, we've defined this, we've defined this label variable, and we don't know how to include it, where our HTML-ish markup stuff lives. So first things first, because it's JavaScript, of course we can use that variable, but we just don't know how to do so yet. So just like in HTML, we kind of have start and stops of types of information with an opening and a closing tag. In JSX, the way that we start JavaScript and stop writing JavaScript, we would just use curly braces. So right where I had my tags before, I'm just going to throw in some curly braces. I've stated the value of label here, so I want, basically I'm saying this is a JavaScript wrapper, and that's going to return the value that the user has passed. And in this case, we passed, boop, no click me. We're getting so much closer to building our first React app. And the great thing is that now that we've defined this prop, we can use a bunch of buttons, maybe more serious than no click me, across our build where we can define that label. Cool, right? But I mean, I don't know that it's much of a win to just be able to customize the copy that goes between the opening and closing brace. So maybe we also want to add more props. As we said, it's just an object. We can just keep populating it with whatever values that we want. So in this case, I'm creating a new prop. It's called size. I'm assigning it the value of primary. I'm defining it rather with the value of primary, and then color, a new prop, and it's going to be blue. And before we even maybe venture down trying to figure out how we're going to get those props to do anything with our component, first things first, we probably need to assign some styles that those are going to go to. So here's just a base outline of maybe some styles I'm going to use on my button. And again, we've had that button.css file just sitting there waiting for us to do something with it. So here, we've done something with it. In the case of organization, I always like to kind of group the classes that map to whatever values are possible to pass through the props. So in this case, I'd button.props.color. Cool. Cool beans. So that's what our component currently looks like. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to break it out into separate lines. So just again, JavaScript, wrap it in parentheses so we can return multi-lines. And then the important thing to note is that we can't assign a class, right? We wanted those props to affect the button somehow with classes. So we can't use class in JSX because it's a reserved word in JavaScript. So we'll just use something called class name that React allows for us to use on components. And first, before we start with dynamically assigning classes, let's test to make sure that our that base style that I had outlined above actually applies. So here we're assigning class name button just like we would. There's nothing too new here. We're looking at Basically, everything we'd see in like our HTML markup, except we're just camel casing class name, and the value of label is going to be dynamic. Approachable, easy, we got this. That's what it looks like. Not great. But we tested that style applied, and it worked, and that's great. So first thing, I'm going to take you through one of my favorite workflows with creating components. I think this is like a great place to start learning with customization. So whenever I'm like creating a component that's going to have, well, like those core components generally always have a bunch of modifiers because there's many contexts that they're used across because they're the core ones, right? So my favorite way to begin is I generally create a classes array. So just above where I'm returning my markup, I made a new variable called class. It's going to be an array, and first thing I'm going to pass it is like hard-coded, cool, we're always going to apply button. So I'm passing it as a string because like that's always going to be the default base style. Next, I'm also going to, it's all just JavaScript, pass these props that we have. So we have props.size that's going to come in, and that's going to return whatever string it is that the user defined when we're using it in context. So we have props.size and props.color. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is just like we would have before, we're trying to get to a place where we have, we would have before like our markup created a button and then assigned all these classes to it. We want to generate something very similar in our JSX. So we already know how to use JavaScript in JSX. All we need to do is assign curly braces, or like start with curly braces. Before we had the string of button. Now we're just going to say like, cool, something dynamic is going to happen there. Something JavaScript-y is going to happen within there. And because this is an array, we can just pull a classes.join. So all I'm doing here is going through like the array, and between every value, it's going to create a space. If we don't add the space is like contained in the strings. If we don't add the space, it's going to kind of jam it into one line, and that's not what we want. We want to create it so it looks like, yeah, like so. We want the spaces there. Right, that's how CSS classes apply. We're not doing anything too different. We're just doing it like way faster and magically. So that means that in our context, where whenever we're using our button, we can just call our button, we can pass our label value, we can pass our size value and our color, and we can start creating more and more I guess, instances of these components across our app. And it's important to note that probably your button is going to be more than just like assigning classes and the value of a label. Most likely you're going to get to a state where, and probably even many more props than this, you might like have something that tracks whether the button's disabled. You might have a function that you can pass to an on-click handler. But props are objects, so just keep jamming whatever you need in there to make whatever functionality you need. And guess what? Just finish the button, drag it over into that done column, and get started on your next component. So once you go through all these, I don't know, like say these like remaining four, that like our card and our heading, facilitator, and date, those ones that we keep outlining as our core components, we're actually gonna like move into a new concept called composability. So composability is so easy in React. This is, I think, like a pretty esoteric definition. I just like to think of composability as like the ability to compose, so like literally create new instances of something by calling on like, I guess, including different ones. But this is like the official definition, which I felt like I had to have the diligence of having. So a keyword here for me is like recombinant, like we can keep having like different ways of like assembling this stuff. And I guess I keep using the word assemble because quite frankly, once you do outline your core components, that's what you're doing. You're assembling these pieces. So that means for a curriculum card, that component definition will probably look something like this. We've created a card elsewhere, a card component elsewhere. We've created a heading and our facilitator button we've already done together. But that means that the file for curriculum card will potentially be like as simple as this, where all these small core components know exactly what it is that they like need to be doing, and the file can be like at like this sparse. Same with the bootcamp card, and then same with the next event card, and then same with the event section, where like now we have these like 3 instances of these specialized components, our cards, and we're just including them in our section, which we're in this case also calling or we're creating as a component, so that finally when we get to our dashboard, we're just assembling all these pieces. And before you know it, we're like 7 views in, we're like so close. We've just like gotten so much closer to building our first React app. Finishing our first React app. Ooh. Okay, so first off, for me, the process of like writing components was extremely, I guess like inviting. Like it wasn't because of JSX. It was like, oh, I'm not doing anything different. I'm just kind of doing it in a different environment. I'm doing it in JavaScript. So that was like super, super welcoming and like easy to wade into. Also, isn't it great how diligent React makes us at like being reusable and like having a very disciplined process as developers? And then finally, isn't it great how quickly we were able to like define that first component and then just move on to the next thing, and then before you know it, we have a whole section. Before you know it, we have a whole page. Crazy. Anyway, so build wins. Defining React components is a super approachable process, as we proved. And then finally, once you have defined those core components, you can very quickly hit the ground running and get closer to like resolving those full views by just composing larger and larger components. Okay, one sec. I'm gonna move into my last section, which is testing. So, within our project, right, we've like gotten this far, we've built it, but most likely, we wanna also ensure that it like always functions the way it's meant to function. So we wanna move into testing, most likely. Quite frankly, I personally had a huge like hesitation with, like as a developer, writing tests. In the beginning, I was like, what's worth testing? First of all, I didn't even know about testing. Second, then my next hurdle to like get over was like, okay, but like what justifies writing a test? Like what piece of code should I like immediately recognize as like, oh, this is a testable piece of code? I've always wanted to do it. I've always known that great code ships with tests, but I like just personally have had that like hurdle to jump over of like, where do I begin? And so with React, I began with snapshot testing. So when we're talking snapshot testing, there's like, I guess, two ways. There's snapshot testing as like snapshot UI, which I know my mobile developer coworkers have explained to me, that it's kind of the concept of like you literally, some program would like screen cap the before and after and would find the diff between the two. But when I'm talking about snapshot testing and in the environment of React, I'm talking about a snapshot test that lets you generate what that result code should look like, because again, everything is isolated, so you know exactly what you mean the button to do when you're calling just button. So it allows you to test that isolated piece and just to make sure that it's it's generating the like exact markup that we're looking for, and like even we can test even further functionality than that. So the library that comes along with React, or a library that you can use along with your React project, is a great library called Jest. Jest is fantastic, but one thing that we should note here is that when we're testing, we don't like run npm start in our command line, right? We're doing like npm test. So that means a new build process, and we just said no build processes until we know React. Except if you start with the create React app project starter, it just comes in there, like it comes as part of the package, and they already have an example test for you. So you're one step closer to testing as a dev. Okay, and it's also important to know how easy it is to like write these tests, and why I was like, oh, I can do this, and I can move into like more and more functional testing. So first things first, in that like isolated area where we're thinking just about button, all we're doing is creating a button.test.js file. So whenever you like append a file name with .test, whatever build flow or like build process create React app comes with, it just like knows to listen in on those. Cool beans. And then for those that have never written tests, it doesn't have to be super terrifying. All we're doing here when we're creating is we're calling this like method, and all we're saying here in plain English, this is like just for the developers that are going to be looking at this later, we're defining what we are expecting it to do. So in this case, our button renders the button component, and then the second argument we have is a function. All right, cool. Not terrifying, super doable. And then within that function, we are going to because this isn't living in the browser environment, we have to like kind of render what that button would be doing should it like find itself in the DOM. So we're leveraging this render function that we have for ourselves, and we're just going to create our button, so like just like we would have used it in any other previous contexts. And then finally, we'll just like turn it into JSON, because it'll be much easier to track the differences that way. It'll like just create less code in our generated snapshot, which, by the way, as we said, it's not going to be an image, it's going to be generated code. Okay, finally, we want to state basically what it is that we're expecting this test to do. So we're expecting that wrapper, so everything we just returned from the render, to match our snapshot. Easy peasy. On the first test run, Jest will create this kind of like this markup for you, which is exactly what we'd expect to see. So it's also like super human for you to like go, or it's super available to you as a human being to go in there and be like, yes, that's exactly what I wanted that button to look like, perfect. That also means that, and maybe a contrived example, but that means that in the future, if we somehow, for whatever reason, decide that, oh, you know what, label was the wrong name for that prop, let's just like call it text, we can run our tests, and if maybe we had like made this change that would affect our entire app, and we hadn't been super intentional so that we also updated that text. Like, we now call that prop text. So if we hadn't updated what was called label before, this test is going to fail because it's like, oh, I don't know, doesn't look, it's not generating the same code that it used to. It's just giving me an empty button, essentially, right? So it's really great because generally no one remembers to like update their tests. So at least like if you're making a big change across your entire app, the test will catch it for you. You'll know you have to also update the tests. And then finally, we'll get a little pass. Cool. It feels so good to see this in your command line. So this is like a really big swooning moment for me. So testing finally became accessible. And now I try to keep a discipline where I don't ship a single component, especially those core components, without writing a snapshot test and making sure that what it generates is exactly what I want it to generate. So that's one gigantic step forward for me, at least. Okay, so the testing wins that we can have on our React project. So testing should really, quite frankly, never be considered a nice to have, but it is understandably extremely intimidating in the beginning. So my advice to you is if you've never tested before, snapshot tests are a really great way to get into the environment and at least like kind of start traversing what's happening here. The other win is that just use Jest. If you're starting with Create React App, it's there. It's the recommended thing that you do, and on top of it, it doesn't just do snapshot testing. So once you're ready to start moving into the world of functional testing, that's what it does best, quite frankly. Okay. Do we have a good idea of how to start our first React project? I think so, yeah? So this is yep, thank you. So this is the process that we talked about today. All right, first off, we talked about planning, right? And planning, I think like this is like a really great way to start like really thinking in components. Most likely through your first project cycle, you'll plan, you'll have a really good idea, you'll go to write the components, and you'll be like, oh, I know how to do this even more reusably, and that's a beautiful win. We talked about how we can leverage components to create a style guide. We learned how we can leverage components to create a style guide, and it should be super easy for us, and that will lead to a better collaborative process between ourselves and designers. We talked about our setup. Don't get too, like, I guess, intimidated by it. You can start with Create React App and then learn more about what's happening behind the scenes when you're ready. Finally, we talked about build. We talked about how to like start defining components. I think we got a good idea of how components are defined. And then finally, testing, a huge win. So this is a really great way to transition into testing with snapshot testing. So anyway, that's my advice to you on how to run through your first React project, especially if you want to have like the loveliest of times. We got one step closer today to also falling in love with React, if this is our first time with experiencing it, and one step closer to our first React project, which I think is a really great step forward. I hope that some of it's been demystified. I believe in you, and you're going to kill it. Thank you, guys. Yeah.